Chapter 1. The Outpost of Stone. The North Sea did not merely surround the Farne Islands. It possessed them. Off the jagged, basaltic coast of Northumberland, where the land fractured into an archipelago of treacherous reefs and low-lying rocks, the water was a restless, shifting leviathan. To the casual observer from the mainland town of Bamborough, the islands appeared as dark, crouched shapes against the grey horizon, seemingly indifferent to the tides. But to those who lived upon them, they were a volatile realm where a shift in the wind could mean the difference between peaceful isolation and absolute peril. Among these scattered fragments of rock, none was more exposed, more desolate, or more vital to the maritime commerce of early Victorian Britain than Longston. It was a low, flat shelf of red volcanic stone, barely elevated above the high water mark, situated at the outermost edge of the outer group of the Farnes. Upon this precarious foundation stood the Longston Lighthouse, a stout, circular tower painted a striking red to provide a daytime landmark against the monochromatic grey of sea and sky. Inside the tower, the air was a constant blend of distinct aromas, the sharp, metallic scent of sperm whale oil used to fuel the lamps, the rich, earthy smell of tallow, the bitter tang of brine that seeped through the thick stone walls, and the faint, comforting fragrance of baking bread from the lower kitchen. This was the domain of William Darling, the appointed principal keeper of the Trinity House Light. At 52 years of age, William was a man built like the tower he tended, broad-shouldered, weather-beaten, with eyes that had spent decades scanning the horizon for signs of foul weather or vessels in distress. His hands were calloused and stained with the grease of the lantern mechanisms, yet they possessed the remarkable dexterity required to trim delicate lamp wicks with absolute precision. Beside him, both in the daily maintenance of the light and in the quiet rhythms of island life, was his 22-year-old daughter, Grace Horsley Darling. Born in her grandfather's cottage in Bamborough, Grace had spent virtually her entire existence within the sound of the surf. When she was a mere infant, the family had lived at the older, less isolated lighthouse on Brownsman Island, where there was enough soil to keep goats and cultivate a modest garden patch. But in 1826, when Grace was 10, the newly constructed tower on Longston was completed, and the family moved further out into the open sea. Grace was a young woman of quiet demeanor, possessing a stature that the mainland newspapers would later romanticize, but which was, in truth, practical and hardened by the realities of her upbringing. Her face, framed by dark hair usually pinned neatly away from her eyes, bore the healthy flush of the salt air. She did not view her life as lonely or restricted. While her older brothers and sisters had gradually left the Rock to seek employment, marriage, or apprenticeships on the mainland, Grace had chosen to remain with her parents, William and Thomason. On this particular morning in early September 1838, the air carried the deceptive calmness that often precedes an autumn tempest. The sky was an expanse of pale, milky blue, and the sea rolled in long, lazy swells of deep jade, breaking with a soft, rhythmic hiss against the barnacle-crusted rocks of the outer reef. Grace stood on the gallery deck just below the lantern room, a heavy woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders against the morning chill. In her hand, she held a soft cotton cloth, which she used to polish the exterior glass panes of the lantern tower. "The glass must be flawless, Grace," her father's voice boomed down from the iron ladder inside the lantern room. "A single smudge of grease or salt spray can distort the beam, and a captain a league out might mistake our signature for the light on the inner Farne. Precision is our first duty to the brethren of Trinity House." "I'm on the final pane now, Father," Grace replied, her voice clear and steady over the sound of the water. She rubbed the glass until it rang with a satisfying squeak, checking her reflection against the pristine pane. Through the transparency, she could see the complex arrangement of argand lamps and parabolic reflectors, highly polished silver-plated copper bowls that caught the light of the burning oil and projected it miles into the darkness. To live on Longston was to live by a strict, unyielding clock. The light had to be lit precisely at sunset and extinguished exactly at sunrise. During the long winter nights, this required a constant, rotating watch to ensure the oil flowed freely, the wicks did not char, and the clockwork mechanism that rotated the cat's eye reflectors did not bind or slow. Even during these shorter September nights, the responsibility was immense. The maritime trade between London, Hull, and the Scottish ports of Dundee and Aberdeen was at its peak, with paddle steamers, brigantines, and coal-carrying colliers constantly navigating the narrow, rock-strewn channels of the Northumberland coast. Once the exterior polishing was complete, Grace stepped inside the lantern room, where William was carefully draining the residue from the oil wells into a brass bucket. The room was warm, heated by the residual warmth of the dozens of lamps that had burned through the night. "The wind is backing to the northeast," William murmured, nodding toward the small brass anemometer mounted near the ventilation hatch. The barometer in the sitting room fell 0.2 of an inch since yesterday evening. "The summer is breaking, Grace. We shall have a blow before the week is out. Let's hope the ships make port before it catches them," Grace said, looking out toward the shipping lanes. In the distance, she could see the faint silhouette of a two-masted vessel, its sails catching the light as it headed north. William sighed, wiping his hands on a piece of oakum. The new steam vessels give these captains a false sense of security. They think because they have an iron boiler and a pair of paddle wheels, they can defy the tides and the shoals of the Farnes. But the sea cares nothing for steam, nor for the pride of engineers. The father and daughter descended the spiral stone staircase, their boots clicking sharply against the solid masonry. The lighthouse was a vertical home, a stack of circular rooms connected by iron and stone. Below the lantern room lay the oil store, filled with heavy iron casks of whale oil. Beneath that was the sleeping quarters, then the sitting room where the family gathered, and finally, at the base, the kitchen and oil cellar, where Thomas and Darling was currently preparing the morning meal. The sitting room was surprisingly cozy, a testament to the family's resourcefulness. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing volumes of travel, history, geography, and divinity. William Darling was a self-educated man who believed fervently in the power of literacy. He had taught all his children to read, write, and cipher, using maps of the world to explain the global trade routes that passed right by their windows. Thomason, a stout woman with a serene face, looked up from her hearth as they entered. "The porridge is ready, William. Sit before it cools. Grace, fetch the fresh water from the cistern." Fresh water was a precious commodity on Longston. Every drop had to be collected from the rainfall on the lighthouse roof and funneled into a large stone cistern beneath the kitchen floor. It was a chore that required constant mindfulness. An open hatch could allow salt spray to contaminate the drinking supply, rendering it useless. Grace pulled up the wooden bucket, noting that the water level was healthy, thanks to the late August rains. As the family sat at the heavy oak table, the conversation remained tethered to the weather and the sea. For the Darlings, the outside world arrived in fragments, letters brought by the North Sunderland boatmen when they delivered provisions, or the occasional newspaper traded with a passing pilot boat. They knew that a young Queen Victoria now sat upon the throne in London, and they knew that the industrial cities of the South were growing at a frantic pace, fueled by the very coal ships that risked their hulls on the Farne rocks. Yet, on this rock, the modern world felt distant. Here, the ancient laws of nature still held absolute sway. As Grace looked through the deep-set window of the sitting room, she watched the first whitecaps begin to form on the distant horizon, like small, pale teeth biting into the blue of the sea. The swell was growing heavier, and the low moan of the rising wind began to whistle through the iron brackets of the gallery deck above. The peace of the morning was fading, and the great autumn storm of 1838 was quietly gathering its strength. Chapter 2. The Iron Hull. While the Darlings prepared for the coming autumn on their isolated rock, a very different kind of energy pulsed through the crowded docks of Kingston upon Hull. 60 miles to the south, Humber Dock was a dense forest of timber masts, iron chimneys, and taut hemp rigging. The air here did not possess the clean, sharp bite of the outer Farnes. Instead, it was a thick, industrial stew of coal smoke, boiling tar, wet horse manure, and the pungent smell of bilge water. Tethered alongside the stone quay was the SS Forfarshire, a modern marvel of the Dundee and Hull Steam Packet Company. Built just 2 years prior in Dundee, she was a magnificent vessel of some 300 tons, her black iron hull gleaming under a veneer of coal dust and harbour grime. She was a luxury paddle steamer, designed to carry both opulent cabin passengers and humbler steerage travellers, alongside a heavy cargo of manufactured goods, sheet iron, spinner's yarn, and fine textiles between the industrial hubs of England and Scotland. On the morning of Wednesday, the 5th of September, 1838, the Forfarshire was a hive of frantic activity. Stevedores shouted over the hiss of escaping steam as they craned heavy crates into the main hold. Passengers arrived in clattering horse-drawn carriages, their leather trunks being hauled up the wooden gangplank by broad-shouldered porters. Standing on the starboard paddle box, looking down over the chaotic scene, was Captain John Humble. A veteran mariner with years of experience navigating the shifting sandbars of the East Coast, Humble was a man who took pride in the punctuality of steam. He checked his gold pocket watch, frowning slightly at the grey sky overhead. The barometer in his cabin had been sluggish, and the weather reports from incoming vessels spoke of a heavy northerly swell developing out in the open water. "We need to clear the river on the afternoon tide, Mr. Logan," Humble said, addressing his chief engineer, who had just emerged from the dark hatchway leading down to the boiler room. Logan was wiping a mixture of sweat and coal soot from his forehead with a greasy rag. "The boilers are filled, Captain," Logan replied, though his voice lacked the robust confidence Humble preferred to hear. "But I must report that the starboard boiler is weeping again. We've patched the flange on the midship boiler, but the scale inside is heavy, and the seams are showing signs of strain under full pressure." Humble waved his hand impatiently. The Forfarshire was a commercial vessel, and a delayed voyage meant lost revenue and furious directors in Dundee. "A weep is nothing new for these boilers, Logan. They are iron, not glass. The company had them surveyed in January, and they passed muster. We have a full complement of passengers and a valuable cargo. We sail on time." Logan sighed but nodded, descending back into the hot, claustrophobic belly of the ship. Down below, the environment was a hellish contrast to the elegant saloon cabins above. The boiler room was a cramped cavern of white-hot fires and scalding iron. Firemen, the skin glistening with sweat, shoveled coal into the furnaces, the roar of the drafts drowning out all conversation. The heat was immense, radiating from the three massive iron boilers that generated the steam to drive the ship's giant paddle wheels. Up on deck, the passengers were settling into their respective worlds. In the first-class cabin, wealthy merchants, a local manufacturer, and several ladies of status admired the mahogany paneling, the plush velvet cushions, and the gleaming brass fixtures. Among them was Mr. Daniel Donovan, a young and articulate gentleman from Scotland, who was returning home after business in London. He sat near the skylight, reading a journal and occasionally conversing with Mrs. Dawson, the wife of a Dundee builder, who was traveling with her two young children. "A fine vessel, is she not, madam?" Donovan remarked, glancing up as the ship gave a slight shudder, the great paddle wheels commencing their slow, experimental revolutions. "It is marvelously fast," Mrs. Dawson replied, adjusting a shawl around her youngest child. "But I confess, the vibration makes me uneasy. My husband prefers the traditional sailing smacks, but time is money nowadays, they say." In stark contrast to the luxury of the saloon, the steerage passengers were crowded onto the open deck near the bow and in the cramped fore cabin. These were agricultural laborers, weavers, and poor families traveling with all their worldly possessions tied up in rough canvas sacks. Among them were several migrant workers from Ireland and Scotland, quiet men and women who looked out at the disappearing coastline of Hull with anxious eyes. They had no velvet cushions or mahogany tables, they had only the hard deck, the biting wind, and whatever shelter they could find behind the piled crates of cargo. At exactly 15 minutes past 12, the Forfarshire cast off her mooring lines. The heavy splash of her paddle wheels beat the muddy waters of the Humber into a frothy foam. With a loud, triumphant blast of her steam whistle, the great ship turned her bow eastward toward the open sea. As they cleared the Spurn lightship and entered the North Sea, the true character of the day became apparent. The wind, which had been a moderate breeze in the sheltered harbor, was blowing steadily from the northeast. The Forfarshire began to pitch and roll as she met the outer swells, her iron hull groaning as she climbed over the waves and dropped into the troughs with a heavy, metallic thud. In the engine room, Logan watched the pressure gauges with a worried eye. The weeping from the starboard boiler had worsened with the violent motion of the ship. Scalding water was now trickling from a seam, hissing as it struck the hot ashpans below. "Keep the pumps going," Logan shouted to his assistant over the deafening clatter of the piston rods. If the water level drops too low in that boiler, the tubes will burn out, and we'll lose half our power before we even sight the Yorkshire Hills. By evening, the ship had passed Flamborough Head. The sky had turned the color of bruised iron, and the sea was a chaotic expanse of white-crested waves. The Forfarshire was making poor headway against the headwind, her paddles striking the water unevenly as she rolled. Inside the cabins, the initial excitement of the voyage had dissolved into the grim misery of seasickness. The elegant saloon was now silent, save for the groaning of the timber and the occasional crash of pottery from the galley. Captain Humble stood on the bridge, his oilskins streaming with salt spray. He looked out into the gathering darkness, knowing that the most dangerous stretch of the voyage still lay ahead. The Northumberland coast, with its hidden reefs and the treacherous Farne Islands, was less than 24 hours away. He placed his trust in the iron hull and the steam engines beneath his feet, unaware that the fatal flaw was already widening in the dark, scalding depths of the boiler room. Chapter 3: The Gathering Tempest. By the morning of Thursday, the 6th of September, the deceptive calm of the week had entirely vanished from the Farne Islands. The wind had veered fully into the northeast, blowing with a steady, punishing force that whipped the sea into a frenzy of white water. At Longston Lighthouse, the day began not with dawn light, but with a heavy, leaden gloom that seemed to compress the horizon until the mainland was completely obscured from view. Grace Darling stood at the sitting-room window, her hand resting against the cold glass. The stone tower, built of solid blocks of Bramley Fall stone, vibrated with every massive wave that slammed into the outer rocks. The sound was deafening, a continuous, low roar punctuated by the sharp, explosive cracks of water hitting the base of the tower and sending sheets of spray flying higher than the lantern deck itself. Her father, William, sat at the table, carefully cleaning the spare burner assemblies by the light of a single tallow candle. His face was grim. He had checked the barometer at first light. The mercury had plummeted further, indicating that the true heart of the storm had not yet arrived. "It is a classic autumn gale, Grace," William said without looking up from his work. "The kind that catches the summer traders unprepared. The sea is running high through the fairway, and the surf on the Goldstone is a solid wall of foam. Will the boatman from North Sunderland be able to put out if we need provisions?" Grace asked, turning from the window. William gave a dry, humorless laugh. "No boat from the mainland will cross the inner sound today, nor tomorrow. We are entirely on our own until this blow spends its fury. Ensure the oil lamps in the kitchen are filled, and check the shutters on the lower levels. If a window gives way under this pressure, the sea will drown the hearth in minutes." While the Darlings secured their stone fortress, the SS Forfarshire was fighting for her survival some 40 miles to the southeast, off the coast of Yorkshire. The situation on board had degraded from uncomfortable to desperate. The northerly gale was slamming directly into the ship's bow, slowing her forward progress to a mere crawl. Down in the engine room, the environment had become a waking nightmare. The leak in the starboard boiler had become a catastrophic breach. Boiling water and pressurized steam were no longer merely weeping from the seam. They were escaping in violent, scalding jets that filled the cramped room with a choking white fog. The air was thick with sulfur and the smell of burning iron. Chief Engineer Logan, his hands severely blistered from an attempt to tighten a failing valve, shouted through the steam to his firemen. "We cannot maintain pressure. The water is dropping faster than the hand pumps can supply it. The fires are being quenched by the leakage." The water poured down onto the burning coals, creating dense volumes of black smoke and suffocating steam that drove the firemen back toward the ladders, gasping for air. One by one, the furnaces of the starboard boiler were extinguished, rendered useless by the rising flood of scalding water in the ash pits. With only the port and midship boilers functioning, the engine's power dropped by half. The massive iron piston rods slowed their rhythm, their steady thumping turning into a halting, strained groan. Up on the bridge, Captain Humble felt the change immediately. The Forfarshire lost her momentum, her bow falling off from the wind. A massive wave struck her broadside, smashing into the starboard paddle box and splintering the heavy timber casing. The ship rolled violently to a terrifying angle, sending unsecured crates of cargo sliding across the deck and smashing into the bulwarks. Mr. Daniel Donovan managed to crawl out of the flooded saloon and onto the companionway ladder. Through the spray, he saw a scene of absolute chaos. The steerage passengers, drenched to the skin and shivering from the biting cold, were clinging to the iron railings and the base of the mainmast. Women were weeping, and men were praying aloud as the sea broke over the bow, sweeping away ropes, buckets, and anything else not bolted to the deck. Donovan made his way toward the captain's position, holding onto the iron handrails with white-knuckled desperation. "Captain, the water is coming up through the floorboards in the lower cabin. The passengers are terrified. Are we making for a harbor?" Humble did not look at him, his eyes fixed on the gray wilderness ahead. "Get back below, sir. The engines are crippled, but we are still making steering way. We are past the T's, and there is no safe harbor for a vessel of this size in a northerly gale until we clear the Tyne or reach the shelter of the Firth of Forth. We must push on." But Humble's words were more defiant than realistic. By mid-afternoon, as the ship crawled past Sunderland, the port boiler failed as well. The leakage had drowned its fires, leaving only the center boiler struggling to produce steam. The great paddle wheels, which had proudly beaten the waters of the Humber just 24 hours earlier, were now turning so slowly that they offered virtually no resistance to the massive waves. The ship was no longer mastering the sea, she was completely at its mercy. As darkness began to fall around 4 o'clock, the wind increased to a full hurricane force. The rain arrived, not in drops, but in driving, horizontal sheets that stung the skin like needles and reduced visibility to less than a ship's length. The Forfarshire was now drifting blindly northward, her steering gear strained to its limits, her engines dead, and her hull groaning under the immense weight of the water she was taking on. At Longston, Grace Darling ascended the spiral stairs to help her father light the great lantern. It was precisely sunset, though no sun had been seen all day. As William struck the flint to ignite the first argand lamp, the bright, steady beam pierced the gloom, striking the driving rain and creating a halo of brilliant white light around the top of the tower. Grace looked out into the screaming darkness. She knew that somewhere out there, in the labyrinth of hidden reefs and raging waters, ships were desperately trying to find their way. She prayed that the light they were tending would be enough to warn them away from the terrible rocks of the Farnes, unaware that the shattered iron hull of the Forfarshire was already drifting directly toward them. Chapter 4. The Blind Drift. The loss of the final boiler at approximately 8 o'clock on Thursday evening plunged the SS Forfarshire into absolute vulnerability. The great pistons, which had provided a reassuring, mechanical heartbeat throughout the voyage, came to a final, grinding halt. The sudden absence of engine noise left only the terrifying sounds of the storm, the howling of the gale through the rigging, the splintering of timber, and the immense, rhythmic thundering of the North Sea against the iron hull. Without steam power, the vessel lost all steering way. She swung broadside to the heavy seas, rolling so violently that her mainmast dipped toward the crests of the waves. On the open deck, the situation was catastrophic. The heavy sea broke continuously over the bow, smashing the remaining bulwarks and washing the heavy deck cargo, including several crated carriages and barrels of sheet iron, into the sea. Captain Humble knew that without engines, his only hope of saving the vessel and the 50-odd souls on board was to convert the steamer into a sailing ship. "Get the sails unbent," he screamed through the darkness to his first mate, Mr. Johnston. "We must set the mainsail and the jib. If we can get enough wind in the canvas, we might claw our way out to the eastward, away from the lee shore." A crew of terrified sailors crawled onto the slick, pitching deck, their hands freezing as they fought with the stiff, frozen canvas. It was a perilous task. The deck was a sheet of wet iron, sloshing with freezing water and choked with tangled ropes. With a great effort, they managed to hoist the jib and a small portion of the mainsail. The heavy fabric snapped with the sound of pistol shots as it caught the hurricane-force wind. For a brief, agonizing moment, the maneuver seemed to offer hope. The Forfarshire turned her bow slightly to the northwest, gathering a small amount of headway. Humble hoped he could guide her into the fairway, the deep water channel that lay between the Farne Islands and the Northumberland mainland. If he could find the channel, he might bring the ship to an anchor under the lee of the inner Farne, or even beach her safely on the sands near Budle Bay. But the night was black as pitch, and the horizontal sleet and salt spray reduced visibility to absolute zero. The captain was navigating entirely by guesswork, blind to the deadly geography of the coast. He did not know that a powerful, spring tide was running like a millrace, combining with the northerly gale to drag the heavy, waterlogged hull much further westward than his calculations allowed. Down in the dark fore cabin, Daniel Donovan found himself huddled with the steerage passengers. The luxury of the upper saloon had been abandoned as the rising water flooded the carpeted floorboards. The air down below was foul, thick with the smell of vomit, wet wool, and the terrifying scent of bilge water rising beneath their feet. A single oil lantern swung wildly from a deck beam, casting long, frantic shadows across the pale faces of the passengers. Mrs. Dawson sat on a wooden locker, her arms wrapped tightly around her 2 children, protecting them from the violent lurches of the vessel. "Are we near the land, sir?" she whispered to Donovan, her teeth chattering uncontrollably from the cold. "The captain is seeking shelter, madam," Donovan replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the icy knot of fear in his own stomach. "The ship is stout, and we have sails set. We must keep faith in the crew." Suddenly, a massive crash shook the forward part of the vessel. The jib sail, unable to withstand the immense pressure of the gale, tore completely free from its bolts with a deafening rip, flying off into the darkness like a white phantom. Stripped of her forward sail, the forefarsha fell off the wind once more, turning her broadside back to the crushing power of the waves. Up on the bridge, Captain Humble wiped the salt from his eyes, staring desperately into the gloom. Through the driving rain, he caught a sudden, terrifying glimpse of something directly ahead. It was not the open water of the channel, nor the dark silhouette of the mainland. It was a brilliant, flashing eye of light, piercing the storm from high above. "A light!" Johnston shouted, pointing through the spray. "Is it the inner Farn?" Humble's heart sank as he recognized the rhythm of the flash. It was too far out, too exposed. "No!" he cried out in horror. "It is the Longston light. God help us, we are in the middle of the outer breakers." Before the crew could even attempt to drop the heavy bower anchors, the blind drift of the forefarsha came to an abrupt, catastrophic end. The vessel was lifted high upon the crest of a monstrous wave and carried forward with immense momentum. As the wave receded, the 300-ton iron hull was dropped with sickening force directly onto the jagged, basaltic ridge of the Big Harkar Rock, less than a mile from the Darling's lighthouse. The sound of the impact was like a clap of thunder. The sharp volcanic stone tore through the iron bottom of the ship as if it were parchment. The passengers and crew were thrown violently from their feet as the vessel ground heavily against the reef, her timbers splintering and her iron plates buckling under the immense, unyielding weight of the sea. Chapter 5: The Splitting of the Ship. The first strike against the Big Harkar Rock was merely the beginning of the destruction. The SS Forefarsha was pinned by her midship section upon a sharp, elevated ridge of basalt, her bow pointing toward the northwest and her heavy stern hanging helplessly over deep, churning water. The immense weight of her iron boilers, combined with the hundreds of tons of cargo still trapped in the holds, created an intolerable structural strain as the massive waves continued to lift and drop the vessel against the stone. "Launch the boats!" Captain Humble shouted, his voice nearly cracked with desperation as he scrambled along the listing deck. "Get the quarter boats lowered before she breaks." But the order was issued too late, and in an atmosphere of complete panic. The crew, now recognizing that the vessel was doomed, rushed the starboard quarter-boat, ignoring the cries of the passengers huddled near the companionway. First Mate Johnston and several able seamen flung themselves into the small wooden boat as it swung wildly from its davits. Before the boat could be properly secured or lowered, a massive wave struck the side of the steamer. The water rushed up the iron hull, lifting the small boat and smashing it violently against the ship's side before dropping it into the boiling sea. Amid the confusion, Daniel Donovan managed to leap from the deck, catching the gunwale of the small boat just as it drifted free into the darkness. He looked back toward the steamer, shouting for others to jump, but the gap widened instantly. The small boat, containing only 9 souls, mostly crew members and Donovan himself, was swept away by the powerful current, disappearing into the blinding rain and leaving the passengers behind to face their fate. On board the stranded vessel, the final catastrophe occurred at approximately 4 o'clock on Friday morning. A mountainous wave, higher and more powerful than any that had preceded it, rose out of the dark. It struck the forefarsha right at her midship section, precisely where the iron plates were already buckled and torn by the rock. With a terrifying sound that combined the screech of tearing iron with the explosive crack of fracturing oak timber, the modern paddle steamer broke completely in two. The aft section of the vessel, comprising the elegant first-class saloon, the private cabins, and the main deck where Captain Humble and his wife were standing, was instantly severed from the forward part of the ship. The powerful tide, running through the narrow channel like a millrace, caught the floating mass of the stern. Within seconds, the entire aft section, along with the captain, his wife, and nearly all the cabin passengers, was dragged into the deep, turbulent water of the Sound. Their screams were instantly swallowed by the roaring of the gale, and the dark water closed over them, leaving no trace of their existence. The forward half of the vessel, including the forecastle, the bowsprit, and a portion of the heavy iron machinery, remained wedged firmly upon the jagged teeth of the big Harkar rock. The force of the splitting had thrown the remaining steerage passengers from their shelter, casting them out onto the freezing, wind-swept stone of the reef itself. Among those cast onto the rock was Mrs. Dawson. She lay on the slippery, seaweed-covered basalt, her body bruised from the impact, her clothes completely saturated by the icy water. In her arms, she held her two young children, a boy and a girl, binding them tightly to her chest with a tattered woolen shawl. "Stay close to me," she cried out, though the wind snatched her words away before her children could hear them. "Hold fast to the stone." Near her, Chief Engineer Logan and a handful of steerage passengers, including an agricultural laborer named John King, had managed to crawl to a slightly higher, more sheltered ledge of the rock. The reef offered virtually no protection from the elements. The big Harkar was a low, desolate shelf, and at high tide, the waves washed completely over its lower sections. The survivors were forced to cling to the cold, wet stone with white-knuckled desperation, their fingers bleeding as they gripped the barnacle-crusted crevices to prevent being swept into the sea. The darkness was total, save for the white foam of the breakers and the distant, mocking eye of the Longston light, which continued to flash its steady warning from less than a mile away. The survivors could see nothing of their surroundings. They knew only that they were trapped on a narrow sliver of rock in the middle of a hurricane-force gale, with the freezing spray constantly washing over them. As the hours crawled toward dawn, the intense cold began to claim its victims. The steerage passengers, already exhausted from days of travel and hours of seasickness, had no stamina left to resist the hypothermia that crept through their limbs. One by one, their strength failed, their fingers slipped from the stone, and they collapsed onto the reef. Mrs. Dawson felt the terrible, creeping numbness in her own hands. She looked down at her children in the gloom, praying for the morning light to come, yet fearing what that light would reveal. The storm showed no signs of abating, and on the distant, isolated tower of Longston, the Darlings were still unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded on the rocks just beyond their windows. Chapter 6, First Light. The dawn of Friday, the 7th of September, brought no comfort to the Farne Islands. It arrived not as a clear sunrise, but as a slow, agonizing thinning of the darkness, transforming the black night into a heavy, oppressive shroud of slate-gray mist and driving rain. The wind had not relented. It continued to scream out of the northeast, whipping the sea into mountainous, chaotic waves that broke over the outer reefs with an unrelenting, rhythmic thunder. Inside Longston Lighthouse, Grace Darling had spent the final hours of the night watch in the lantern room. Her eyes were burning with fatigue from the hours spent tending the argand lamps, ensuring the oil lines did not freeze or clog in the bitter cold. As the clockwork mechanism chimed the hour of 5, she prepared to extinguish the light, the dawn now sufficient to warn any vessels, if any remained afloat in such a wilderness of water. Before descending to the kitchen, Grace took up her father's heavy brass telescope, a long, well-worn instrument that William had used for decades to scan the shipping lanes. She wiped the moisture from the glass lens with a piece of dry linen, stepped to the northwest window of the lantern tower, and adjusted the brass focus ring. The view through the glass was a terrifying spectacle of natural fury. The sea through the outer Sound was a solid mass of churning white foam, with waves colliding from different angles as they rushed through the shallow channels between the rocks. Grace slowly traversed the telescope across the horizon, checking the familiar landmarks of their isolated world, the blue caps, the clove car, and finally, the dark, jagged shape of the big Harkar rock, situated nearly a mile away. Suddenly, her breath caught in her throat. She froze, her hands gripping the cold brass barrel of the telescope with sudden force. Through the shifting veil of sea spray and rain mist, she could see that the familiar silhouette of the big Harkar was altered. A large, dark mass was wedged firmly upon the southern ridge of the reef. It was the shattered, iron bow section of a great vessel, its timber bowsprit pointing uselessly skyward like a broken finger. The iron plates were torn and twisted, and the remnants of rigging flapped wildly in the gale. Grace adjusted the focus, leaning closer to the glass. She scanned the slippery, seaweed-covered basalt below the wreckage. At first, she saw only the white water washing over the stone. But then, as a wave receded, she spotted a movement, a tiny, desperate flicker of life against the gray background. "Father!" she cried out, her voice sharp with an urgency that pierced the heavy roar of the wind outside. "Father, come quickly. There is a wreck on the Harkar." William Darling, who had been resting on a cot in the watch room just below, was up the iron ladder in an instant. His boots clattered against the steps, his face pale with immediate concern. He took the telescope from his daughter's trembling hands and brought it to his eye, squinting through the gloom. "Merciful heaven," William muttered, his jaw tightening as he focused on the reef. "It is a steamer. She has been broken in two. The stern is entirely gone." "Are there people, Father?" Grace asked, her hand resting on his shoulder. "I thought I saw something move near the lower ledge." William remained silent for a long moment, his seasoned eye analyzing the terrible geometry of the scene. He watched the massive breakers slam into the Harkar, sending sheets of solid water 40 feet into the air. Then, in a brief clearing of the spray, he saw them. He said, his voice dropping to a somber whisper. "There are people. I can see 3, no, 4 or 5 souls clinging to the rocks near the ironwork. They are on the leeward side, but the tide is rising, Grace. If the water comes up much further, the surf will wash them off into the deep channel." "We must go to them, Father," Grace said immediately, her voice steadying with a quiet, fierce determination. "We cannot leave them there to drown before our eyes." William turned to look at his daughter, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and profound dread. He knew the sea in a way Grace could not. He knew the immense, bone-crushing power of the current running through the sound. "Grace, look at the water. It is a hurricane. No boat from the mainland can reach them, and our own Coble is built for coasting, not for clearing the outer breakers in a northerly gale. To put out in this weather is madness. We would be carried onto the rocks ourselves before we could pull a single oar." At that moment, Thomas and Darling entered the lantern room, having heard the commotion from below. She looked from her husband to her daughter, her face tight with anxiety. "What is it, William? What has happened?" "A large steamer has struck the Harkar, Thomason," William replied, handing her the telescope. "There are survivors on the rock. Grace wants to launch the Coble." Thomason looked through the glass, her hands shaking. She saw the tiny, helpless shapes of her fellow human beings trapped in the middle of the raging sea. But she also looked at her husband and her youngest daughter, the only family she had left on the rock. "William, you cannot go," she wept, her voice breaking. "You are an old man, and Grace is a woman. If you go out into that water, I shall lose you both, and I will be left alone on this rock with nothing but the dead." Grace stepped forward, placing her arms around her mother's shoulders, yet her eyes remained fixed on her father. "Mother, we cannot sit here in comfort by the fire while women and children die on the stone less than a mile away. If the boatmen from North Sunderland were here, they would go. We are the only light they have. We must try." William walked to the window, looking out at the path they would have to take. It was a labyrinth of hidden reefs, violent cross-currents, and breaking waves. He knew that if they launched, they would have to row against the wind, using every ounce of their strength just to clear the shelter of the Longston Rock. But as he looked through the telescope one more time and saw a survivor feebly waving a tattered piece of cloth, his maritime conscience spoke louder than his fear. "Get your oilskins, Grace," William said quietly, his voice hard as the stone tower. "We will launch the Coble. May God have mercy on our souls." Chapter 7. The launch of the Coble. The boathouse at Longston was a cold, cavernous slit of stone built into the lowest foundations of the lighthouse base. It smelled strongly of dried bladderwrack, tarred hemp, and the linseed oil used to preserve the timber of the family's solitary boat. Inside, the vessel sat upon wooden rollers, pointing downward toward the slipway that disappeared into the white, churning froth of the landing cove. The boat was a traditional Northumberland coble, a vessel born of centuries of North Sea experience, yet entirely unique in its design. It was a 20-foot open boat, constructed of stout larch planks on heavy oak frames. Unlike mainland boats, a coble possessed a high, raked bow designed to lift over the heavy breakers of the coast, but its bottom was completely flat, tapering down to a deep, narrow stern equipped with a long, raking rudder that extended far below the keel. It was a superb craft in the hands of a master, capable of surf work that would swamp a standard rowboat, but it was notoriously unstable if caught broadside by a breaking sea. William Darling stood by the starboard gunwale, checking the heavy square oars, or wands, that sat in the wooden rowlocks. These were not the light, polished oars of a pleasure boat, they were heavy poles of solid ash, flat-bladed and balanced with large blocks of lead near the handles to offset their immense weight. "We must row with the wind on our quarter as we clear the lee of Longston," William shouted over the deafening roar of the surf outside the boathouse doors. He had to lean close to Grace so she could hear him over the gale. "The tide is running hard to the southwest through the Piperlite Channel. If we let the current catch the flat bottom before we get headway, we'll be carried straight onto the blue caps." Grace nodded, her face grim beneath the brim of her yellow oilskin sou'wester. She wore a heavy woolen jacket under her oilskin coat, and her long skirts were pinned up and tucked away to prevent them from tangling around her feet in the bottom of the boat. Her hands, encased in thick canvas mittens, gripped the smooth wood of the bow oar. "I am ready, father," she said. Her voice was remarkably calm, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Thomas and Darling stood at the head of the slipway, her apron flying wildly in the wind that rushed through the half-open boathouse doors. Tears mixed with the salt spray on her lined cheeks, but she did not try to stop them now. With her strong, work-hardened hands, she helped her husband position the wooden rollers under the keel. "God protect you," Thomason whispered, her voice lost to the storm as William threw open the heavy timber doors. The world that greeted them was a chaotic nightmare of water and wind. The sea did not roll in orderly waves, it boiled and erupted in every direction, whipped by the hurricane-force gale into a confusing maze of cross seas and breaking surf. The spray was so thick that the big Harkar rock was completely swallowed from view, buried somewhere within the grey wall of mist a mile away. "Now, Grace, push!" William yelled. Together, father and daughter threw their weight against the heavy timber hull. The coble slid down the grease-slicked rollers, its heavy oak keel scraping sharply against the rock before dropping with a violent splash into the cold water of the landing. The boat pitched instantly, its high bow leaping skyward as the first wave caught it. William scrambled over the stern, his heavy seaboot splashing into the surf as he grabbed his oar and thrust it against the rock to keep the boat from being slammed back into the stone slipway. "Row, Grace. Give way." Grace was already in her seat, her boots braced firmly against the wooden stretcher on the floorboards. She threw her weight backward, pulling the heavy ash oar with all the strength in her shoulders. The blade caught the churning water, and the coble surged forward, clearing the immediate danger of the boathouse rocks. The physical exertion was immediate and punishing. To row a Northumberland coble against a northerly gale required an immense, sustained output of human muscle. Every wave that struck the high bow threatened to arrest their forward momentum, stopping the boat dead in the water and sending sheets of freezing spray flying over Grace's head, drenching her back and face despite her oilskins. William sat behind her, pulling the heavy stroke oar. His eyes were not on the destination, for he had to row backward, looking over the stern, but on his daughter's back and the shifting patterns of the water around them. He used his deep knowledge of the Farne currents to guide them, anticipating the dangerous eddies that formed behind the reefs. "Steady, Grace," he shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Keep the stroke long and even. Do not fight the wave, let the bow lift, then pull as she drops into the trough." The navigation was a matter of life and death. Between Longston and the Big Harkar lay the Little Harkar and a series of low, hidden reefs known to the locals as the Colours. At high tide, these rocks were covered by a few feet of water, creating terrifying fields of breakers where the sea boiled like a cauldron. William had to guide the Kobold through a narrow, winding channel of deeper water, avoiding the breakers while fighting the powerful tide that threatened to drag him out into the open ocean. As they cleared the partial shelter of the Longston Reef, the full force of the hurricane caught them. The wind hit the high bow of the Kobold like a physical wall, threatening to turn the boat broadside. Had the flat-bottomed craft turned, it would have rolled over instantly, spilling them both into the freezing, 50-foot-deep water of the Sound. Grace felt the skin on her palms begin to blister and tear beneath her mittens as she fought the immense leverage of the oar. The wind caught the long blade, trying to rip it from her grasp or twist it in the rollick. Her muscles ached with a deep, burning fatigue, and her breath burned in her throat. Yet, every time she felt her strength waver, she pictured the tiny, desperate shape of the survivor she had seen through the telescope, waving his tattered cloth from the cold stone of the hawser. For nearly 20 minutes, the father and daughter fought for every yard of progress, the lighthouse gradually receding into the grey mist behind them. They were alone in a wilderness of water, small as a walnut shell on a mountain torrent, driven forward by nothing more than iron will and the ancient, seafaring duty to save the shipwrecked. Chapter 8, The Teeth of the Reef. As the Kobold neared the leeward side of the big hawser, the true horror of the shipwreck was revealed in all its stark, devastating detail. The forward half of the SS Forfarshire lay wedged upon the basalt ridge like a giant, dying beast of iron and wood. The massive paddle shaft, bent and twisted by the impact, protruded from the wreckage at a grotesque angle, its remaining iron paddle wheel jammed into a crevice of the rock. The sea hit the exposed iron plates of the bow section with a sound like artillery fire, sending plumes of black water and splintered timber spinning into the air. William Darling turned his head slightly, squinting through the dense salt spray. "The water is boiling over the eastern shelf, Grace. We cannot land there. We must bring her in under the partial lee of the main hull, where the ironwork breaks the worst of the swell." The maneuver was fraught with extreme danger. The tide was rising rapidly, and the current through the narrow channel was swirling in violent, unpredictable eddies. If the Kobold was thrown against the jagged basalt or the sharp, torn iron plates of the steamer, its thin larch planking would be stove in instantly, leaving both the rescuers and the survivors to drown together. On the slippery rock, the survivors watched the approach of the tiny open boat with a mixture of disbelief and frantic hope. Chief Engineer Logan had managed to drag himself down closer to the water's edge, his hands bleeding as he clung to a barnacle-crusted ledge. Near him, John King, the steerage passenger, was supporting Mrs. Dawson, who lay shivering violently, her tattered shawl soaked with the freezing spray. "Hold her steady, Grace," William roared as the Kobold was lifted by a heavy, foaming swell that rushed past the stern of the wreck. "I must make the leap when the bow lifts." Grace braced her feet against the wooden stretcher, her arms trembling with exhaustion. Every muscle in her back and shoulders burned from the long pull across the Sound, but she knew that the most critical moment of the entire undertaking was now upon them. She had to counteract the powerful suction of the receding waves while keeping the boat close enough to the rock for her father to exit. The Kobold surged upward on the crest of a wave, its bow rising level with a flat, kelp-covered shelf of the hawser. "Now," William shouted. With the agility of a man half his age, William dropped his oar and sprang from the gunwale. His heavy sea boots struck the slick basalt, slipping momentarily on the wet bladderwrack before he found his footing and threw his arms around a heavy iron bolt protruding from the rock. He scrambled upward, out of the reach of the next wave, holding a coiled hemp painter line in his hand. The sudden loss of her father's immense weight caused the Kobold to lurch violently. The wind immediately caught the high bow, threatening to spin the boat broadside and smash it against the reef. "Keep her off, Grace. Keep her off," William screamed, his voice nearly drowned by the thunder of the surf. Grace was now entirely alone in the boat. She shifted her position instantly, moving to the middle thwart to master both heavy ash oars herself. It was an astonishing display of skill and physical endurance for a 22-year-old woman. She had to backorder with her left oar while pulling hard with her right, fighting the powerful current that tried to drag the boat under the overhanging ironwork of the collapsed steamer. Through the driving rain, Grace looked directly at the survivors on the rock. Less than 20 feet away, Mrs. Dawson lay huddled over her two children. Grace's heart sank as she looked at the little faces. They were completely still, the skin a terrible, waxy white against the dark stone. She knew, with a sudden, sickening clarity, that the intense cold of the night watch had already done its worst to the little ones. Yet, there was no time to mourn. The living was still fighting for their breaths. William scrambled across the wet stone to where Logan and King were holding Mrs. Dawson. "Can you walk, man?" William asked, gripping Logan's shoulder. "My hands are gone, and my feet are numb," Logan gasped, his teeth clicking together so hard he could barely articulate the words. "But I can scramble if you help me." "We must take the woman first," William said, looking back at the pitching Coble. "Grace cannot hold the boat in this position for long. Every minute we waste increases the risk of the line parting." Together, William and John King lifted Mrs. Dawson from the freezing basalt. She was nearly unconscious, her limbs stiff and unresponsive from advanced hypothermia. They dragged her down to the edge of the shelf, waiting for the precise moment when the rising swell brought the Coble's gunwale within reach. In the boat, Grace watched the water, her eyes wide with concentration. She felt the skin on her hands crack and bleed as she pulled against the oars, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The sea around her was a white, foaming vortex, but she maintained her station with a precision that would have done credit to the most experienced pilot boatman of the time. She was the only link between these stranded souls and survival, and she refused to let her strength fail. Chapter 9, The First Allocation. The transfer of human life from the slick, wave-washed basalt of the Big Harkar to the rising and falling gunwale of the Coble was an exercise in absolute precision. William Darling stood ankle-deep in the churning surf, his left hand gripping a heavy knot of rock while his right arm extended toward John King, who was maneuvering the shivering, near-catatonic figure of Mrs. Sarah Dawson forward. "Wait for the lift, King," William shouted over the explosive hiss of the spray. "Do not let her weight drag you into the trough. Grace, pull the starboard oar, keep the bow out." In the middle of the boat, Grace Darling pulled against the heavy ash wands with every ounce of remaining strength in her forearms. The Coble surged upward on a foaming crest, its side coming level with the kelp-covered shelf for a fleeting 2 seconds. In that brief window, William and King swung Sarah Dawson over the gunwale. She tumbled heavily onto the damp floorboards of the bow, coughing up salt water and crying out through cracked, blue lips. "My babies," she wept, her voice a ragged whisper that barely cut through the gale. "Do not leave them on the stone. For the love of God, do not leave my children." William looked back at the higher ledge of the rock, where the two small bodies lay wrapped in a corner of a sailcloth, completely still. As a father, the sight struck a deep, painful chord within him, but his long years of service to Trinity House had trained him to make the hard, unyielding choices that survival demanded. "We can only carry the living, madam," William said to himself, his voice thick with a quiet sorrow as he turned back to face the remaining men. "We have no space, nor time, for those who have already passed. If we overload this boat, we shall all join them before the hour is out." William rapidly assessed the physical condition of the remaining survivors stranded under the iron hull of the Forfarshire. There were 9 people alive on the reef in total. The traditional Northumberland Coble was designed to carry a substantial load, but in a hurricane-force gale with an extreme cross-sea, its stability depended entirely on the ability of the crew to maintain steering way. If the boat became sluggish and waterlogged from too many passengers, a single breaking wave over the broadside would swamp them instantly. "You two," William pointed at Chief Engineer Logan and a sturdily built fireman who had managed to retain some movement in his limbs. "You are injured, but you have the strength of seamen. Get into the middle Thor. You will need to take the oars from my daughter for the return leg." Logan, his hands raw and blistered from the boiler room steam, scrambled into the boat, followed by the fireman. They took their places on the wooden benches, their bodies shaking violently from the hours of exposure. Next, William helped a severely bruised male cabin passenger over the side, positioning him low in the bottom of the boat to keep the vessel's center of gravity as stable as possible. 5 survivors were now loaded into the open craft: Sarah Dawson, the 2 ship's crewmen, and 2 male passengers. The boat sat visibly lower in the water, its flat larch bottom resting heavily against the shifting eddies. 4 men, including the laborer John King, remained on the big Harkar reef, their faces pale as they watched the space inside the Kobold disappear. "We are coming back for you," William yelled to the men left behind, his voice firm with a solemn vow. "The crewmen here will row back with me. Keep to the high ledge and do not move from the ironwork." John King nodded, drawing his threadbare coat tighter around his chest. He understood the math of the sea. He stepped back toward the shelter of the broken bow section, setting his back against the iron plates to endure another hour of the freezing spray. William flung himself back over the stern of the Kobold, his heavy sea boots landing with a hollow thud against the floorboards. He immediately grabbed the stroke oar from the rollock, gesturing for the two rescued crewmen to take over the forward ones. Grace, her hands bleeding through her canvas mittens, refused to move to the stern. She stayed at her station, her fingers locked around the wood, ready to assist with the rhythm of the stroke. "The wind is at our backs now, but the tide is turning against us," William shouted, his eyes scanning the gray wilderness of the Sound. "If the flood tide catches us in the open channel, it will drag us south toward the Kettle Rock. Pull together, men. Pull for the light." With 5 additional souls on board, the return journey to Longston promised to be a desperate race against the shifting elements. The Kobold turned its high, pointed bow away from the shattered iron carcass of the Forfarshire, dropping into the deep troughs of the channel as the gale drove them forward into the blinding rain. Chapter 10. The Safe Haven. The return journey to Longston Lighthouse was a different species of peril. While the northerly gale was now at their backs, pushing the overloaded Kobold forward with frightening velocity, the turning flood tide ran directly against the wind. This opposition created a chaotic, treacherous phenomenon known to North Sea mariners as a roost, a stretch of water where the waves did not roll, but leaped upward in sharp, unpredictable pyramids of broken white water. With 5 survivors packed into the small craft, the Kobold's gunwale sat dangerously close to the surface. Every time the boat dropped down the steep face of a wave, the flat bottom struck the trough with a sickening slam, and the freezing sea slopped over the sides, pulling around the ankles of the shivering passengers. "Bail! Keep the water down!" William Darling roared from the stern, his hands straining against the heavy master oar to keep the vessel from broaching. The rescued fireman, though his limbs were stiff with cold, grabbed a wooden scoop from beneath a bench and began flinging the water back into the sea with frantic, rhythmic movements. Beside him, Chief Engineer Logan gripped his ash wand with raw, bleeding hands, matching his stroke to William's steady cadence. Grace remained centered in the vessel, her small frame braced against the middle thwart, using her remaining physical energy to steady the bow oar and keep the boat's nose from dipping into the rollers. In the bow, Sarah Dawson lay curled in a tight knot, her face pressed against the wet larch planking. She was no longer weeping aloud. Her grief had settled into a silent, hollow stare that fixed upon the floorboards. The physical cold was rapidly shutting down her system, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that caught in her throat. Through the blinding rain, the red cylinder of Longston Tower gradually materialized out of the gray gloom. It stood like a solid, unyielding sentinel amid the chaos, its windows casting a warm, flickering glow from the tallow candles within. As the Kobold neared the landing cove, William saw his wife, Thomason, standing at the edge of the stone slipway, holding a heavy hemp line coiled and ready. "Stand by to drop the oars," William shouted as the boat entered the narrow, rock-walled channel of the cove. "Grace, get the bow line ready." The transition from the wild open water to the confined space of the landing was a moment of extreme tension. A single miscalculated stroke would allow the surf to slam the fragile boat against the stonemasonry of the slipway. But the Darlings worked with perfect cohesion born of a lifetime on the rock. As the bow lifted on a surging wave, Grace flung the line. Thomason caught it with practiced ease, quickly looping it around an iron mooring bollard and hauling with all her might. William leaped into the shallow, foaming water, his heavy sea boots crunching against the stone as he grabbed the gunwale to steady the pitching craft. "Get 'em out, quickly. Thomason, take the woman first." Sarah Dawson was lifted from the boat like a child, her body completely limp as Thomason and Grace supported her weight between them. They dragged her up the grease-slicked stones of the slipway and through the heavy iron outer door into the base of the lighthouse. Logan and the other 3 survivors crawled out behind her, their knees buckling as their feet touched solid ground for the first time in over 12 hours. The kitchen of Longston Lighthouse was transformed instantly into a field hospital. A massive fire of Northumberland coal blazed in the iron hearth, radiating a fierce, drying heat that filled the circular room. The air was thick with the rich scent of boiling beef broth, coffee, and the sharp smell of vinegar, which Thomason used to rub the survivors' frozen limbs to stimulate the blood circulation. "Sit them near the hearth, Grace," Thomason directed, her voice calm and commanding as she handed out thick woolen blankets and dry flannel shirts from the linen press. "Strip those wet clothes from the woman. We must get the warmth back into her core before the slumber claims her." Grace knelt on the stone floor beside Sarah Dawson, gently wrapping her in a dry, heavy blanket. With a pewter spoon, she coaxed a few drops of hot broth between the woman's blue lips. Sarah swallowed weakly, her eyes briefly focusing on Grace's face with a look of profound, silent gratitude. "You are safe now, madam," Grace said softly, her hand resting on the woman's trembling shoulder. "You are in the Longston light." But outside the thick stone walls, the storm still raged with unabated fury, and the low moan of the wind through the ventilation hatches was a grim reminder of the task yet unfinished. 4 men were still marooned on the freezing shelf of the Big Harkar Rock, their strength fading with every minute that passed. William Darling stood by the kitchen door, his oilskins dripping a puddle onto the stone floor, his eyes fixed on the clock on the mantelpiece. The tide was turning, and the second trip would require an even greater trial of human endurance. Chapter 11, The Second Crossing. The air inside the lower kitchen was a suffocating fog of steam and coal smoke, but outside the heavy timber door, the North Sea remained an icy, roaring wilderness. William Darling stood by the stone threshold, tightening the leather strap of his sou'wester beneath his chin. His muscles ached with a dull, throbbing protest from the first crossing, but his mind was fixed firmly on the 4 men still marooned on the Big Harkar shelf. "The flood tide is at its peak, Thomason," William said, looking over at his wife, who was busy wringing out a hot flannel cloth. "The water will be washing over the lower ledges of the reef by now. If we do not fetch those men before the hour turns, the current will drag them into the open sound." Grace stepped forward from the hearth where she had been kneeling beside Sarah Dawson. Her hands were wrapped in clean white linen strips to cover the raw blisters she had earned during the morning pull, but her eyes were bright with determination. "I will take the bow oar again, father. The boat is ready at the slipway." William placed a heavy, calloused hand on his daughter's shoulder, a rare gesture of tenderness from the stern keeper. "No, Grace, you have done your part, and the history of this light will remember it. But look at the woman there. She needs every hand to keep the spark of life in her. Your mother cannot manage her alone if the convulsions take her." He turned his gaze toward the hearth, where Chief Engineer Logan and the ship's firemen, sensory awareness slowly returning to their limbs through the fierce heat of the fire, were standing up. They had stripped off the drenched woolens and were now clad in dry, mismatched trousers and heavy shirts provided from William's own sea chest. "We are coming with you, Mr. Darling," Logan said, his voice still shaking slightly, though his jaw was set with professional pride. "We are crew of the Forfarshire. It was our ship that brought those poor souls to this rock, and we will not sit by your fire while our passengers are left to drown." The fireman nodded in silent agreement, stepping forward to take a spare pair of canvas mittens from Thomason. "I can pull an oar, sir. The heat of the fire has put the blood back into my arms." William assessed the 2 men with a keen, nautical eye. They were professional seamen, hardened by years of labor in the demanding environments of steamship engine rooms. They understood the discipline of a boat and the precise language of the sea. "Very well," William nodded. "Logan, you take the midship oar. Fireman, you take the bow. We will use the tide to carry us down to the leeward side of the Harkar, but the return pull will be a devil of a job. Mind my words and match my stroke exactly." The second launch of the Coble from the Longston slipway lacked the frantic terror of the first, but it was no less perilous. The wind had shifted slightly to the north-northeast, blowing with a steady, deep-throated howl that flattened the tops of the waves into long streaks of white spindrift. As the boat cleared the partial shelter of the landing cove, the 3 men were hit immediately by a wall of spray that threatened to blind them. With 3 powerful men at the oars, the Coble moved through the water with a different, heavier momentum than before. Logan and the fireman pulled with the rhythmic, synchronized desperation of men who knew exactly what lay at stake. William sat at the stroke oar, his eyes locked on the white water boiling over the little Harkar reef to their port side. "Keep her nose up, Bal," William shouted through the storm. "There's a cross-current running out of the Piperlite Channel. If it catches the flat bottom, we'll be carried onto the rocks before we can backwater." The navigation was a testament to William's decades of experience on the outer Farns. He knew every submerged boulder, every shifting eddy, and every deceptive patch of shallow water. He guided the Coble through the boiling confusion of the sound like a surgeon navigating a delicate incision, using the immense force of the turning tide to help propel the heavy craft toward the destination. As they approached the big Harkar for the second time, the sight was even more devastating than it had been an hour earlier. The rising tide had swallowed the lower shelves of the reef entirely. The shattered iron bow section of the forefascia was now surrounded by a swirling vortex of white water, the iron plates groaning as the waves lifted and dropped the immense weight against the basalt foundation. Huddled on the highest pinnacle of the rock, directly beneath the shadow of the broken windlass, were the final 4 survivors. Among them was the agricultural laborer, John King, his arms wrapped around his knees, his face encrusted with white salt spray. Beside him, 3 other steerage passengers clung to the iron stays of the rigging, their eyes wide with a frantic, desperate hope as they saw the red-painted bow of the Northumberland Coble rise over the crest of the final breaker. They had held fast through another hour of exposure, and their rescue was finally at hand. Chapter 12, The Final Freight. The final 4 men on the big Harkar were in a far more desperate condition than those rescued on the first trip. An extra hour of exposure to the relentless, freezing spray had drained the last reserves of their physical stamina. John King, the agricultural laborer, was barely conscious, his fingers locked around a rusted iron stay of the vessel's windlass with a death-like rigidity. Beside him, 3 other steerage passengers, men who had left their homes in search of work, lay huddled together in a hollow of the basalt, their faces gray and their limbs unresponsive. "Bring her in close, Logan," William Darling shouted from the stern, his boots braced hard against the floorboards. "Fireman, stand by with the painter. We must take him off before the next set of rollers breaks over the pinnacle." The tide had risen so high that the big Harkar was no longer an island. It was a reef almost entirely submerged, its jagged outline marked only by the furious eruption of white surf. The Coble wallowed in the backwash, its large sides groaning as the cross-currents pulled at its flat bottom. Logan and the firemen worked with the desperate coordination of true mariners. They backed water with their oars, countering the powerful surge that threatened to smash the open boat against the iron carcass of the forefascia. William leaped onto the slippery rock for the second time, his sea boots sinking deep into the cold kelp as he scrambled up to the pinnacle. "Let go the iron, man," William commanded, prying John King's frozen fingers away from the stay. "The boat is here. Your torment is at an end." King collapsed forward into William's arms, his legs completely unable to support his weight. With a great effort, William dragged the laborer down the slick rock, waiting for the precise second when the Coble rose on a surging wave. Logan caught King by the shoulders, pulling him over the gunwale and depositing him onto the damp floorboards of the bow. One by one, the remaining 3 steerage passengers were hauled from the rock. They were dead weight, their clothes saturated with brine and their bodies shaking so violently that they could not assist in their own rescue. The Coble sat lower in the water than it ever had before, its freeboard reduced to a mere matter of inches. With William, Logan, the fireman, and the 4 rescued men, there were now 7 souls aboard the small craft, and the sea was running higher than ever. "Push off," William roared, leaping back over the stern as a massive wave broke over the northern ridge of the Harkar, sending a sheet of solid water flying over their heads. "Give way, men. Pull for your lives." The return journey to Longston was a monumental trial of human endurance. The wind had risen to a full hurricane force, and the flood tide was now at its maximum strength, rushing through the outer sound like a mill race. Every yard of progress had to be bought with agonizing physical labor. Logan and the firemen pulled until their lungs burned and their vision blurred, their blistered hands leaking blood onto the shafts of the ash oars. William handled the heavy stroke oar, his eyes locked on the horizon, watching for the dangerous breaking seas that could swamp them from behind. He knew that a single miscalculated stroke, a single moment of fatigue from any of the three rowers, would allow the Kobold to broach. If the boat turned broadside to these monstrous waves, it would fill and sink in seconds, and all 9 survivors of the Forfarshire, along with their rescuers, would be lost to the deep channel. For nearly 30 minutes, the boat seemed to make no progress at all. It would climb the steep, foaming face of a wave, stall at the crest as the gale hit the high bow, and then drop heavily into the trough, only to meet another wall of grey water. Through the driving rain, the red tower of the lighthouse appeared agonizingly distant, a mocking beacon of safety that remained just out of reach. "Keep the stroke, men," William gasped, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "Do not look at the rock. Look at the light. We are gaining on it." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the steady rhythm of the oars began to master the current. The Kobold crawled past the dangerous breakers of the Little Harkar, entering the more sheltered water under the lee of the Longston Reef. The sudden reduction in the size of the waves brought a collective gasp of relief from the exhausted rowers. At the landing cove, Thomason and Grace were waiting. Grace had run down from the kitchen, her hands still bandaged but her spirit undaunted. She plunged waist deep into the cold surf, grabbing the bowline as the Kobold slid up the stone slipway. Together with her mother, she hauled the heavy, waterlogged boat onto the wooden rollers, securing it against the powerful backwash. The rescue was complete. All 9 survivors who had clung to the big Harkar rock were now within the safe, unyielding perimeter of the Longston Light. As the final 4 men were assisted up the stairs and into the roaring heat of the tower kitchen, William Darling collapsed onto a wooden bench, his chest heaving as he stared at his bleeding hands. He looked up at Grace and Thomason, his face weary but his eyes clear. They had done the duty to Trinity House, and to humanity. They had snatched 9 souls from the very jaws of the North Sea. Chapter 13, The Crowded Tower. With the second crossing successfully completed, the heavy timber outer doors of Longston Lighthouse were slammed shut and bolted against the gale. The sudden transition from the screaming wilderness of the landing cove to the thick, stone-walled interior of the tower brought a profound, heavy silence. Inside, the air was warm, stagnant, and thick with the overwhelming aromas of the refuge, the sharp smell of vinegar, the rich steam of boiling beef broth, the scent of damp wool drying near the hearth, and the metallic tang of sperm whale oil from the upper levels. The modest lighthouse, designed to accommodate a family of 3, was now a sanctuary for 14 souls. The 9 survivors of the SS Forfarshire, Sarah Dawson, Chief Engineer Logan, the ship's fireman, and 6 male steerage passengers, were distributed across the lower circular rooms of the tower. The kitchen, usually a model of pristine domestic order, resembled a battlefield infirmary. Sarah Dawson lay on a makeshift pallet of blankets and sheepskins directly before the great iron grate. Grace Darling knelt at her side, gently bathing the woman's forehead with warm water. Sarah's physical shivering had subsided, replaced by the deep, exhausted lethargy of severe exposure, but her mind remained trapped on the big Harkar reef. The water was so dark, Grace, Sarah whispered, her eyes staring blankly at the whitewashed stone ceiling. It took them from my arms. I held them until my fingers would not close, but the sea was stronger than a mother's hands. Grace held the woman's cold hand, her own fingers raw and wrapped in linen dressings. She did not offer empty phrases of comfort. She knew that the sea on this coast was an absolute, unyielding force that offered no apologies. "The storm cannot reach you here, Sarah," Grace said softly, her voice steady and calm. "You must rest now. My mother has made a broth from our winter stores. It will put the strength back into your blood." On the level above, in the small sitting room, William Darling sat at the oak table with Chief Engineer Logan. Both men were exhausted, their faces lined with grease and fatigue. William had opened his personal journal, dipped a steel-nibbed pen into an inkwell, and was preparing to record the day's extraordinary events for the official logbook of Trinity House. "I must record the names and occupations of all those brought ashore, Mr. Logan," William said, his voice husky from shouting over the gale. "And I will require the official timeline of the vessel's failure for the directors in London." Logan rubbed his blistered hands, staring at the candle flame. She was a modern ship, Mr. Darling. 300 tons of iron. But the starboard boiler was weeping before we even cleared the Humber. Captain Humble thought steam could defy a northerly gale, but when the fires were quenched, we were nothing more than a blind drift. The ship broke in two like a piece of dry pine. The sea cares nothing for steam, nor for the pride of engineers, William replied quietly, his pen scratching sharply against the heavy paper. On this rock, we live by older laws. As darkness fell on Friday evening, the reality of their confinement became apparent. The storm showed no signs of abating, the barometer in the sitting room remained dangerously low, and the massive rollers continued to slam into the base of the tower, sending a rhythmic, shuddering vibration through the solid masonry. It was clear that no boat from North Sunderland or Bamborough would be able to cross the inner sound for days. This prolonged isolation presented an immediate crisis of logistics. The lighthouse provisions, delivered monthly by the Trinity House tender, were carefully rationed for a small family. Now, with 14 people to feed, the stocks of flour, hardtack, salted beef, and potatoes were depleted at a terrifying rate. Thomas and Darling, a woman whose life had been defined by resourcefulness, took complete charge of the domestic economy. She systematically catalogued their supplies, calculated the daily requirements, and established a strict rationing system. The great iron pot on the hearth was kept simmering continuously, filled with a sparse but nourishing stew of salted meat and dried peas. "We have bread enough for 2 days if we are careful," William, Thomason murmured to her husband as they met on the spiral stairs. "And the water cistern is healthy, thanks to the late rains. But the men are large, and their hunger is sharp now that the warmth has returned to them. We must hope the weather breaks by Monday." Sleeping arrangements required a complicated geometry of space. The survivors were given the family's beds and cots, while William, Thomason, and Grace took turns resting on the hard stone floors of the watch room or sitting upright on wooden stools by the kitchen fire. No one complained. The memory of the freezing basalt of the big Harkar was too fresh in everyone's mind. Throughout the long, dark hours of Friday night and the whole of Saturday, Grace moved between the rooms, a quiet spirit of comfort. She tended the fire, washed the soiled bandages, and listened to the fragmented, terrifying recollections of the steerage passengers. Despite her own profound physical exhaustion, she refused to rest until she was certain that every occupant of the tower was warm and fed. She had not yet realized that while they were confined within this stone cylinder, the story of what she and her father had accomplished was already beginning to leak out to the wider world, carried by the first group of survivors who had escaped in the quarter boat. Chapter 14. The Breaking of the Storm. By the morning of Monday, the 10th of September, the relentless fury of the North Sea had finally spent itself. The northerly gale, which had held the Farne Islands in a suffocating grip for nearly 4 days, dissolved into a light, westerly breeze. The heavy, leaden clouds fractured, allowing pale shafts of early autumn sunlight to strike the red stone of Longston Lighthouse and illuminate a sea that was still bruised, heavy with a massive, rolling swell, but no longer murderous. Inside the tower, the air of tense confinement began to lift. Sarah Dawson, though physically frail and deeply scarred by her immense loss, was able to sit upright on a wooden stool by the hearth. Her hands, clean and neatly bandaged by Grace, gripped a mug of warm chicory coffee. "The water is quiet today," Sarah murmured, looking through the deep-set kitchen window at the calm, green surface of the landing cove. "It looks so peaceful now. It is hard to believe it could be so cruel." "The sea has many faces, madam," William Darling replied as he descended the spiral stairs, carrying his heavy brass telescope. "It finishes its work, then acts as if nothing occurred. But the mainland has sighted us. There are boats clearing the harbor at North Sunderland." Grace stood on the exterior gallery deck, her woolen shawl pinned against the morning chill. Through the clear air, she watched 3 traditional cobles and a larger, multi-oared salvage boat moving out from the Northumberland coast. As they drew nearer, she recognized the familiar faces of the local fishermen and boatmen, men who knew the Darlings well and had feared for their safety during the unprecedented gale. The first vessel to slide up the stone slipway was the North Sunderland lifeboat, manned by a crew of rugged coastal pilots. Among them was Robert Darling, William's own son, who had spent the storm in a state of agonizing anxiety on the mainland, knowing his family was at the absolute epicenter of the tempest. "Father! Grace!" Robert shouted, leaping into the shallow surf and hauling the boat up the wooden rollers. "We heard word of a wreck from some crewmen who made the beach at Shields in a quarter boat. We thought the tower itself might have suffered under such a blow." "The light stands firm, Robert," William said, his voice a steady anchor as he greeted his son with a firm grip of the hand. "But we have 9 souls inside who require transport to the mainland. The forefasher is broken on the Harkar." The boatmen crowded into the lighthouse kitchen, their heavy leather sea boots clattering against the clean masonry. As they listened to Chief Engineer Logan and the steerage passengers recount the details of the rescue, a profound, stunned silence fell over the room. The local fisherman, who knew the terrifying mechanics of the outer sound currents better than anyone, looked at 22-year-old Grace with a mixture of reverence and absolute disbelief. "You pulled the bow oar, Grace?" asked one of the veteran North Sunderland pilots, his face weather-beaten and lined with decades of sea service. "In a northerly gale through the Piperlight. There is not a crew of 4 men on the whole coast who would have volunteered to launch a Coble into that vortex." Grace looked down at her bandaged hands, her face reddening with a modest discomfort at the sudden scrutiny. "My father required an oar hand," she said simply, her voice low and even. "We could see them from the lantern room. There was no choice to be made." The evacuation of the survivors was a somber, orderly affair. Sarah Dawson was gently lifted into the largest of the mainland boats, wrapped in dry blankets provided by Thomason. Chief Engineer Logan and the remaining steerage passengers followed, their faces still pale but their expressions filled with a deep, emotional gratitude as they looked back at the circular stone tower that had been their salvation. "God bless you, Grace darling," John King, the laborer, said as he stepped into the boat, his hand resting briefly on the gunwale. "Every man who breathes on this deck owes his life to your arms." As the flotilla of boats turned their bows back toward the mainland, William and Grace stood together at the edge of the stone slipway, watching them recede into the distance. The quiet, solitary routine of Longston Lighthouse was restored, but it was a deceptive peace. The survivors were returning to a rapidly industrializing Britain, a nation connected by steamships, railways, and a highly competitive printing press. The story of what had occurred on the isolated basalt ridge of the Big Harkar was about to reach the mainland, and the lives of the Darling family would never be the same again. Chapter 15. The Printing Press. The story of the Longston rescue did not travel slowly, it exploded. When the mainland boats landed at North Sunderland, the 9 survivors were met by a small crowd of local residents, customs officers, and a regular correspondent for the Newcastle Chronicle. As the injured were carried to the local inn and treated by a parish physician, the details of the Friday morning rescue began to stitch together into a coherent, breathtaking narrative. Within 48 hours, the machinery of early Victorian journalism was in full, frantic motion. In the dark, ink-scented printing houses of Newcastle and Hull, typesetters worked through the night, hand-assembling rows of lead type to print extra editions of the weekly broadsheets. The initial accounts, based on the emotional testimonies of Chief Engineer Logan and Daniel Donovan, presented the public with an image that captured the national imagination like nothing before. By mid-September, newspapers from Edinburgh to London were running front-page columns detailing the disaster. The Times described the loss of the SS Forfarshire as a tragedy of national proportions, but it was the role of Grace Horsley Darling that transformed a standard maritime disaster into a cultural phenomenon. An act of heroism has been performed on the coast of Northumberland, one widely circulated report declared, which for true courage, nobility of spirit, and selfless devotion, has no parallel in the annals of our maritime history. A young, delicate female, nurtured in the isolation of a lonely lighthouse, has dared to defy a hurricane to save her fellow creatures. To a Victorian public increasingly preoccupied with ideals of feminine virtue, chivalry, and Christian charity, Grace was the perfect heroine. She was young, modest, and completely untainted by the commercialism of the growing industrial cities. She had performed her deed not for reward or recognition, but out of a pure, instinctive sense of duty. The immediate consequence of this sudden fame arrived at Longston Lighthouse in the form of a heavy, leather sack delivered by the North Sunderland pilot boat. For decades, the Darlings' mail had consisted of occasional letters from family members or official circulars from the Trinity House directors in London. Now, William Darling sat at the kitchen table, staring in absolute bewilderment at a mountain of correspondence that overflowed onto the stone floor. "There are over 50 letters here, William," Thomason said, her spectacles perched on the bridge of her nose as she held up a thick sheet of expensive, cream-colored paper. "This one is from a lady of high title in Yorkshire. She wishes to know what brand of soap Grace uses to preserve the softness of her skin against the salt spray." William gave a gruff, dismissive snort, his pen scratching sharply as he worked on his official reports. "Tell her she uses the same tallow and lye that cleans the grease from the lantern lenses. These people on the mainland have lost their senses, Thomason. We performed a standard rescue under the regulations of the service. There is no need for this madness." Grace sat by the window, her hands still bearing the faint, pink scars of her blisters. She held a letter from a young girl in London who had enclosed a silk ribbon, asking for a lock of Grace's hair in return. Grace felt a deep, intensely uncomfortable knot form in her stomach. She had never sought to be an object of public curiosity. To her, the rescue was a fragment of a terrible night that she wished only to forget, a night defined by the roaring of the wind, the heavy pulling of the oars, and the pale, tragic faces of Sarah Dawson's dead children. "They write as if I am a character in a storybook, Mother," Grace whispered, looking out toward the big hawker, where the rusted iron bow of the forefascia still sat like a dark tooth against the horizon. "I am not a heroine. I am an oar hand. Any person with a boat and a pair of arms would have done the same." But the public would not allow her to remain a simple lighthouse keeper's daughter. The letters were merely the first wave of an intrusion that would soon breach the natural defense of the sea. Artists were already boarding the coastal steamers from London, their sketchbooks tucked under their arms, determined to capture the likeness of the Maid of the Isles, for a public that was hungry for portraits, lithographs, and souvenirs of the legendary rescue. Chapter 16. The Intrusion. The isolation that had protected the Longston Lighthouse for over a decade collapsed before the end of September. The sea, which had once been a natural wall keeping the outside world at bay, became a highway for the curious, the wealthy, and the opportunistic. On any day when the North Sea was calm enough to permit navigation, a steady stream of chartered fishing boats and pleasure steamers from Newcastle, Berwick, and even Hull would drop anchor in the deep channel just outside the landing cove. Wealthy tourists in fine broadcloth coats and ladies in elaborate silk crinolines scrambled up the grease-slicked stone slipway, their leather boots sliding on the wet bladderwrack. They brought with them an energy that was entirely foreign to the Rock, a loud, demanding curiosity that treated the working lighthouse as a public museum and the Darling family as exhibits. "Is this the girl?" a wealthy merchant from Leeds asked, peering through his gold-rimmed spectacles as he stepped uninvited into the lower kitchen. "The one who pulled the great oar. Remarkable. She looks quite ordinary for such a feat." Thomason Darling stood firmly before her hearth, her arms crossed tightly over her apron, her face hardened into a mask of silent displeasure. She was a woman who valued order and domestic privacy above all things. Now, her clean stone floor was constantly tracked with mud and coal dust from the mainland, and her quiet routines were shattered by strangers who poked through her larders and asked intrusive questions about their income. The most persistent of these visitors were the artists. Among them was Thomas Musgrave Joy, a prominent portrait painter commissioned by wealthy patrons in London to capture a definitive likeness of the heroine. He arrived with massive wooden crates of canvas, heavy iron easels, and bottles of turpentine that filled the circular sitting room with a sharp, chemical stench that drowned out the familiar smell of whale oil. "Hold the oar just so, Miss Darling," Joy directed, adjusting the tilt of Grace's head with a gloved finger. "Look out toward the window, as if peering through the tempest. The public demands a gaze of noble defiance." Grace stood by the window, her arms aching as she held the heavy, lead-weighted ash wand for hours at a time. She felt a profound, exhausting humiliation. She was dressed not in her ordinary working clothes, but in a neat, dark dress that the artist had deemed more appropriate for a Victorian lady. Her face, which usually bore the healthy, salt-flushed color of the Farne air, was pale with fatigue. "Must I hold it like this, sir?" Grace asked quietly, her voice flat. It is not how one holds a wand when the sea is breaking over the gunwale. If you hold it so high, the blade will catch the wind and spin the boat. Joy gave a patronizing, artistic chuckle without looking up from his palette. Accuracy in technique is secondary to accuracy in sentiment, my dear child. We are creating a monument for the national soul. The public wants poetry, not a manual on seamanship. William Darling spent these weeks retreating to the highest levels of the tower. He buried himself in the mechanical maintenance of the light, polishing the brass gears of the rotation clockwork until they shone like mirrors, and checking the argand wicks with an obsessive, frantic precision. He felt a deep, growing resentment toward the mainland authorities who allowed this circus to continue. He had received a formal letter of commendation from the Duke of Northumberland and a gold medal from the Royal Humane Society, but these honors felt hollow while his home was being desecrated by sightseers. One evening, after the final tourist boat had departed for North Sunderland, the family gathered at the oak table in the sitting room. The silence that returned to the tower felt fragile, haunted by the lingering scent of expensive perfumes and tobacco smoke. They took a piece of the old sailcloth from the boathouse, Grace whispered, looking down at her bandaged hands. A gentleman cut a square from it with a penknife while I was posing for the painter. He said it was a relic. William slammed his heavy palm against the table, making the pewter mugs rattle. They are ghouls, Grace. They treat a terrible tragedy, where 40 souls went to the graves in the dark, as if it were a country fair. The company has already begun salvaging the iron from the Harkar. They are breaking up the hull for scrap, and they are breaking up our lives right along with it. Grace looked out through the deep stone recess of the window. In the fading twilight, she could see the distant silhouette of the big Harkar reef. The shattered bow of the SS Forfarshire was visibly smaller now, its iron ribs being systematically dismantled by mainland workers. She realized with a heavy heart that the storm had not truly ended on Monday morning, it had merely changed its shape, and its currents were now dragging her family into a world from which they could never return. Chapter 17. The Weight of Gold. By the time the late autumn gales of November began to scour the Northumberland coast, the spiritual transformation of Grace Darling from a lighthouse keeper's daughter into a national icon was complete. The recognition was no longer merely a matter of tourist boats and intrusive letters, it had received the highest institutional sanctions of the British Empire. A heavy, official packet arrived at Longston bearing the royal seal. Inside was a personal letter from the young Queen Victoria, written from Buckingham Palace, praising Grace for her exemplary courage and feminine devotion. Accompanying the letter was a direct financial gift of £50 from the Privy Purse, an immense sum that exceeded William Darling's entire annual salary from Trinity House. £50 from the Queen herself, Grace, Thomason murmured, her fingers tracing the crisp, embossed paper with a mixture of reverence and awe. And the National Subscription Fund in Newcastle has already passed £700. The great men of the county, the Duke of Northumberland himself, have stepped forward to act as your trustees. Grace sat in her wooden chair by the kitchen hearth, her woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the fierce heat of the coal fire. A dry, hacking cough rattled in her chest, a persistent ailment that had settled into her lungs during the damp, frantic weeks of October and refused to leave. She looked at the gold coins sitting in the small leather purse on the table, but they brought her no joy. The gold cannot buy back our quiet life, Mother, Grace said, her voice thin and raspy. Every post brings more demands. The theatre managers in London wish me to appear on their stages just to sit in a boat and wave an oar. They offer fortunes just to look at me. William Darling looked up from his ledger, his face deeply lined with worry. He had noticed that his daughter's appetite had dwindled to almost nothing, and the healthy, salt-flushed color of her cheeks had been replaced by a pale, translucent complexion that seemed to glow unnaturally in the candlelight. The constant demands of her celebrity, answering hundreds of letters, posing for endless streams of artists, and dealing with the emotional burden of the public's obsession, were consuming her physical vitality far more effectively than any North Sea storm. I have written to the Duke, Grace, William said, his voice hard with a protective anger. I have informed His Grace that you will not leave this rock for any theatre, nor for any public exhibition. You are a servant of the light, not a puppet for the amusement of the London gentry. We have declined the offers. Thank you, Father, Grace whispered, leaning her head back against the cold stone wall. The public, however, did not accept boundaries easily. When they could not possess Grace in person, they turned to commercial substitutes. The pottery works of Staffordshire began producing thousands of cheap, ceramic figurines depicting her idealized version of Grace in a bright blue dress, rowing through perfectly stylized waves. Lithographs and romantic sheet music, such as the Grace Darling Waltz **, were sold in every music shop from Manchester to Bristol. Her name was used to advertise everything from whale oil lamps to ladies' bonnets. Inside the Longstone Tower, the reality of life remained bound to the relentless demands of the winter season. The wind had returned to the north, bringing horizontal sleet and freezing spray that turned the stone gallery deck into a treacherous sheet of ice. The argand lamps required constant maintenance. The heavy winter seas frequently broke over the glass panes of the lantern tower, requiring William and Grace to scale the exterior iron ladders in the dark to clear the salt crust. But Grace found her physical strength failing her during these nightly watches. The heavy ash oars she had pulled so masterfully in September now felt impossibly heavy when she tried to move them in the boathouse. Every ascent of the spiral stone staircase left her gasping for breath, her hand resting heavily against the masonry as she waited for the dizziness to pass. She would look out through the narrow windows into the black, roaring night, watching the steady, rotating beam of the light cut through the driving snow. She had saved 9 lives from the big Harkar reef, but as she listened to the deep, hollow cough that echoed through her small bedroom, she began to realize that the sea had a long memory, and the price of her heroism was being extracted from her own blood, one drop at a time. Chapter 18. The Fading Light. By the arrival of the spring of 1841, the fierce public clamor that had surrounded Longstone Lighthouse had softened into a more permanent, institutional reverence. Yet, the peace that returned to the Farne Islands arrived too late for Grace Darling. The persistent cough that had taken root in her lungs during the damp autumn after the rescue had never truly left her. It had become a constant, draining companion, transforming the once robust 25-year-old woman into a frail shadow of the oar hand who had defied the North Sea. The circular sitting room, once filled with the energetic chatter of portrait painters and wealthy tourists, was now a quiet room of recovery. Grace spent her days sitting in a high-backed armchair near the south window, her lap covered by a heavy woolen tartan shawl. Her hands, which had once handled the heavy ash wands of the Kobold with perfect dexterity, were now thin and pale, the blue veins stark against her translucent skin. "You must take the milk, Grace," Thomason urged softly, holding her earthenware mug to her daughter's lips. "The North Sunderland boat brought fresh dairy from the mainland this morning. It will soothe the burning in your chest." Grace took a small, polite sip, but the effort of swallowing brought on a sudden, violent fit of coughing that left her gasping for breath, her handkerchief stained with a terrifying trace of crimson. She leaned her head back against the cushion, her eyes tracking the steady, rhythmic movement of the sea beyond the glass. "The air feels heavy today, Mother," Grace whispered, her voice scarcely louder than the hiss of the surf below. "Even when the sun shines, the damp seems to seep right through the stone walls. I feel as though the rock itself is drawing the warmth out of my bones." William Darling stood at the top of the stairs, his heavy sea boots silent as he watched his daughter. He had spent his entire adult life mastering the elements, predicting the patterns of the tides, and ensuring that his tower remained an absolute sanctuary against the storm. But as he looked at Grace's hollow cheeks and the unnatural, feverish brightness in her eyes, he felt an agonizing, helpless despair. He was facing an enemy that could not be warned away by a rotating beam of light, nor conquered by the rhythmic pulling of a boat. Recognizing that the harsh, salt-laden atmosphere of the outermost island was worsening her condition, the family made the painful decision to move Grace to the mainland. In the late summer, under the direct protection and financial patronage of Charlotte Florentia, the Duchess of Northumberland, Grace was transported across the inner Sound to the town of Bamborough. The Duchess, deeply moved by Grace's modesty and heroism, arranged for the finest physicians from Newcastle to attend to her. Grace was settled into a quiet, comfortable lodging house in the shadow of the massive, red stone walls of Bamborough Castle, the very fortress her ancestors had watched from the sea for generations. The mainland doctors, arriving in black carriages with their stethoscopes and leather bags of remedies, examined the celebrated heroine with a clinical gravity. They spoke in hushed, serious tones to William, who stood by the bedside, his uniform cap held tightly in his calloused hands. "It is the consumption, Mr. Darling," the senior physician stated flatly, using the common 19th century term for tuberculosis. "The disease is advanced. The damp environment of the lighthouse, combined with the extreme physical and emotional exhaustion she suffered following the disaster of the Forfarshire, has entirely undermined her constitution. No amount of mountain air or bark infusions can restore the tissue that has been lost." The news of the heroine's declining health leaked out to the public, prompting a new wave of attention that the family found deeply distressing. Bulletins regarding her condition were published weekly in the regional newspapers, and the street outside her lodging house was frequently crowded with silent, well-meaning citizens who wished to glimpse the Maid of the Isles before her strength failed entirely. But Grace took no notice of the crowds outside her window. In her quiet hours of fever, her mind regularly slipped away from the mainland town and returned to the wilderness of the outer Sound. She did not dream of the medals, the royal letters, or the gold that sat in the Newcastle Bank. She dreamed of the Longston light. She heard the steady, comforting tick-click of the rotation clockwork above her head, the sharp squeak of the cotton cloth against the lantern glass, and the deep, majestic roar of the North Sea as it rolled over the outer reefs, calling her back to the only home she had ever truly loved. Chapter 19. The Last Watch. The autumn of 1842 arrived in Northumberland with a sharp, biting frost that turned the leaves of the Bamborough oaks into brittle fragments of gold. Outside the small-paned window of the cottage on Front Street, the shadow of Bamborough Castle stretched long and dark across the village green as the afternoon sun dipped toward the Cheviot Hills. Inside the quiet room, the only sound was the shallow, rattling breath of Grace Darling, whose long struggle against the consumption was rapidly drawing to its inevitable close. It was the afternoon of Tuesday, the 20th of October. The room was simple, devoid of the grand oil paintings or the ceramic statues that the public had created in her likeness. Instead, a solitary tallow candle flickered on the washstand, casting a soft, warm light over the bed where the 26-year-old woman lay. William Darling sat on a low wooden chair by his daughter's side, his massive, weather-beaten hand holding hers with a delicate, trembling care. He looked years older than he had on that frantic September morning 4 years prior. The broad shoulders that had mastered the master-oar of the Coble were now hunched with a profound, unutterable grief. Beside him stood his son, George, and Thomason, who had rarely left her daughter's bedside since they had brought her from the Rock. "The wind is from the east today, father," Grace whispered, her eyes opening slowly. They were still remarkably clear, though the feverish brilliance of the past months had faded into a soft, tranquil light. "I can hear the breakers on the beach. It sounds just like the water through the fairway." Grace," William said, his voice thick and strained as he swallowed the knot in his throat. "The tide is flowing. It's a clean sea today, my girl." Grace turned her head slightly, her gaze fixing on the small table where her Royal Humane Society gold medal sat inside its leather case. She had never worn it, nor had she ever used the wealth that had been accumulated in her name. To the very end, she had remained entirely untainted by the Victorian machinery of fame that had sought to consume her identity. "I am glad we stayed by the light, father," she murmured, her voice growing increasingly faint, each word requiring a visible, agonizing effort from her chest. "The mainland is too loud, there are too many people. I miss the quiet of the tower. I miss the lamps." "The lamps are burning bright, Grace," William replied, his tears finally breaking and tracing deep, wet furrows through the salt-crusted lines of his face. "Your brother is tending 'em now. The light will never go out." A profound stillness settled over the room as the twilight began to gather outside the cottage walls. Grace closed her eyes, her breathing slowing to long, gentle sighs. She felt no fear, she was a child of the Farne coast, and she knew the geography of the transition she was making as well as she knew the channels between the reefs. At exactly 8:15 in the evening, with her hand securely resting in her father's grasp, Grace Horsley Darling took her final, quiet breath. The news of her passing radiated outward from the small Northumberland village like a shockwave, carried by the fast mail coaches and the coastal steamers to every corner of the United Kingdom. A nation that had become accustomed to reading of her noble deeds was suddenly plunged into an unprecedented state of collective mourning. The newspapers, which had spent 4 years celebrating her life, now bordered their columns in heavy black ink. The Newcastle Chronicle lamented the loss of the brightest ornament of our county, while the London broadsheets published extensive elegies, comparing her pure, selfless spirit to the ancient martyrs of the church. But in Bamborough, the grief was not a matter of print or poetry. It was a deep, local sorrow. The fishermen, the pilots, and the agricultural laborers, the very people whose lives were bound to the dangers of the coast, recognized that a genuine light had been extinguished. As the preparations for her funeral began under the direction of the parish vicar, the family found themselves once more surrounded by the public eye. But this time, the curiosity was gone, replaced by a quiet, reverent awe for a young woman who had crossed the final, dark channel of her life with the same quiet modesty that had defined her finest hour. Chapter 20. The Monument and the Light. The funeral of Grace Darling, held on Monday, the 24th of October, 1842, was an event that transformed the small coastal village of Bamborough into a vast cathedral of public reverence. Long before the bell of St. Aidan's Church began its deep, solemn tolling, the narrow stone streets were packed with thousands of mourners who had travelled from every corner of Northumberland, Durham, and the Scottish borders. The crowd was a striking cross-section of the society that Grace had inadvertently unified through her heroism. Wealthy landowners and members of the gentry in high silk hats stood shoulder to shoulder with rugged, weather-beaten fishermen from North Sunderland, Holy Island, and Berwick. These men of the sea wore their finest dark woolen pilot coats, their heads bared against the cold autumn wind that swept inland from the beach. The coffin, constructed of simple English oak from the estates of the Duke of Northumberland, was borne from the cottage on Front Street by a rotating crew of local pilots and boatmen, men who had handled the heavy oars of the Northumberland cobles themselves and understood the exact physical price of the deed Grace had performed. William Darling walked directly behind the bier, his tall frame unbowed but his face etched with the absolute gravity of his loss. He wore his full Trinity housekeeper's uniform, the brass buttons dull under the grey sky. Beside him walked Thomason, her head bowed beneath a heavy black mourning veil, her hand resting on the arm of her eldest son. As the procession entered the ancient graveyard of St. Aidan's, the wind died away to a whisper, leaving only the steady, distant crunch of the surf on the sands a quarter-mile away. The parish vicar read the traditional Anglican burial service over the grave, his voice clear and resonant in the quiet air. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life. When the service concluded, and the final prayers were whispered, the crowd did not disperse immediately. They filed past the open grave for hours, dropping small sprigs of heather, autumn leaves, and fragments of ribbon onto the oak coffin lid. They were bidding farewell not merely to a famous name from the newspapers, but to an authentic symbol of human nobility. In the months that followed her burial, a national subscription fund ensured that Grace's resting place would be marked by a monument worthy of her legacy. A grand, neo-Gothic stone canopy was erected in the churchyard, designed by the Newcastle architect Anthony Salvin. Beneath the canopy lay a life-sized recumbent effigy of Grace, sculpted from fine Portland stone. She was depicted lying at rest, her hands clasped gently over her chest, with her historic oar carved into the stone by her side, positioned so that any ship navigating the Farne shipping lanes could look inland and sight her monument against the green hills. But the true monument to Grace Darling was not built of stone, nor did it reside in the crowded churchyard of Bamborough. It remained out in the open, turbulent water of the outer Sound. A few days after the funeral, William Darling boarded the North Sunderland pilot boat and returned to Longston Lighthouse. The circular stone tower stood exactly as he had left it, stout, red-painted, and completely indifferent to the human tragedies that unfolded around its base. He climbed the spiral stone staircase, his boots clicking sharply against the solid masonry, and entered the quiet, empty sitting room. The letters and the visitors were gone now. The public had found new dramas to occupy their attention in the industrial South. The kitchen hearth was quiet, and the circular rooms had returned to their ancient, solitary rhythms. William ascended to the lantern tower, took up his cotton cloth, and began to polish the glass panes, preparing the lamps for the coming winter night. William would continue to tend the Longston light for another 18 years, never missing a watch, never allowing a single lamp wick to char or smoke. He lived to see the paddle steamers replaced by massive iron screw propellers, and he watched the maritime trade of the empire grow to unprecedented heights. Yet, on every morning when the dawn broke grey and misty over the outer reefs, he would take his heavy brass telescope and scan the jagged basalt ridge of the Big Harkar Rock. He did not look for wreckage anymore, he looked at the water. He remembered the precise, synchronized rhythm of the oars, the sound of his daughter's voice over the roaring of the hurricane, and the magnificent, selfless courage of the young woman who had sat in the middle thwart of his boat. Grace had left the Rock, and her name had become a permanent part of the global history of maritime heroism, but to William, as he struck the flint to ignite the great lamps at sunset, she would always be the quiet girl who had stood beside him in the storm, keeping the light alive in the middle of the dark and unyielding sea.